I used to do the traditional points-based grading, give them an exam, I hand it back, and they would look at it and they would say, and they turn around to their neighbor and they would say, oh, what did you get? I got an 83. And their neighbor would be like, oh, well, I got an 85. And they'd say, okay, and they would shove it in their backpack and it would never be seen again. When I switched to standards-based grading, now they look at their test or quiz and they'll turn around and say something like, did you get this standard 7? I don't know how to do that one. And their neighbor will say, oh yeah, I can show you how to do that one. So the conversations they have with each other are completely different.
Welcome to Toddle's School Leaders Project. I'm your host, Cindy Blackburn, and today I'm talking to Dr. Drew Lewis all about his research into standards-based grading. Drew explores the relationship between student wellness and SBG, and we get into the nitty-gritty of what standards-based grading really looks like and its benefits to students. You're not going to want to miss a single second, so let's jump into the episode. Dr. Drew Lewis, I'm so excited to have you here on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Might you kind of set the stage for our listeners and tell us a bit about the work that you do and what you're most passionate about?
Yeah, so I am a mathematician by training. These days I do a lot of work in math education, faculty development, education research, and a lot of that is centered around alternative grading and alternative assessment practices.
Very cool. And I found you through an amazing paper that you wrote all about standards-based grading. And while your research was more focused on higher education, I think there's so much information that we could bring into the elementary, middle, and high school space. So might you start by kind of just defining standards-based grading in your own terms?
Yeah, so to give a one-sentence definition, standards-based grading means that the grades at the end of a course are based on how many standards a student has mastered or demonstrated proficiency of over the course of the term. So typically what this means is if you give a student a test or a quiz or something, you don't necessarily just put a number on the top at the end. So there's no 83% or whatever at the end. Instead, there's a list of the standards that were assessed on that test, and then an indication of their proficiency on those individual standards.
Very cool. So it's moving away from just like number-based grading towards more a holistic achievement of a predetermined learning goal.
Yeah, so some of it's holistic, but some of it's a lot more specific, right? So a lot of times if you're just assigning a bunch of points to things and you add them up and the student gets the paper back and it says 83%, they have no idea, just looking at that, what topics they need to work on, which ones they did well on, right? But with standards-based grading, they have this whole list that says, these are the standards that you showed me that you learned already, and here are the ones that you still need to work on.
So cool. And so practically, does that often look like a rubric of like the various standards that are being assessed, where they were assessed, and then giving students like specific evidence on each one?
Yeah, exactly. So when I'm working with faculty who are converting, a lot of times they may already have these rubrics, and the biggest change for them is to just take the points or numbers off of those rubrics, right? And then they can still assess the proficiency on those individual competencies or standards or whatever words you want to use for that.
Why do you think the number removal is such a big thing? Like if I'm saying you're developing versus 3 out of 4, why does that make a difference?
So there's a mathematical argument, right? So these things are not what we would right? If I say 3 out of 4, right? So 3 is 1 below 4 and it's 1 more than 2. But if we're just having descriptive phrases along with these, there's no distance between those descriptive phrases. Right?
Okay.
So there's a key difference there. Another important difference. So I mentioned the part about kind of averaging these numbers together obscures some things. But another really important difference is that research has shown is that as soon as you start putting those numbers on the student work, they stop paying attention as much to the feedback that you're giving them. And that feedback is what is crucial to the students actually learning and making progress.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think that's so important. So much of it is students' relationship with the feedback versus just the number or the phrase that we're calling it.
Right.
So might you speak further to that? Because in standards-based grading, students are assessed based on mastery. And I'm curious how you've seen this shift students' relationship with learning.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I guess one anecdote I can give is that I used to do the traditional points-based grading, and I would teach calculus to students, and I give them an exam, I hand it back, and they would look at it, and they would say, and they turn around to their neighbor, and they would say, oh, what did you get? I got an 83, and their neighbor would be like, oh, well, I got an 85. And they'd say, okay, and they would shove it in their backpack, and it would never be seen again.
Exactly.
When I switched to standards-based grading, now they look at their test or quiz, and they'll turn around and say something like, did you get this standard 7? I don't know how to do that one. And their neighbor will say, oh, yeah, I can show you how to do that one. So the conversations they have with each other are completely different. And it's the same thing for when they have conversations with me. So used to, they would come to my office hours and say, I got a 63 on this test. What do I need to do? Now they come to my office hours and they say, I need help with this standard that I've tried 3 times and I still haven't demonstrated learning yet. So it's just a completely different conversation around the content and the learning.
I hear so many beautiful practices there, like a shared clarity around learning intentions. And what you're really talking about here is assessment capability, is that we're building students' ability to learn for themselves by growing their own assessment capability.
Yes, so there's that metacognitive aspect too, right? That we're really supporting that they're looking at their own learning as they're going through this.
Gorgeous. You also studied the impacts of standards-based grading on testing anxiety. And
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was some of the most interesting part of your findings. So could you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Yeah, so I started doing this research a few years back because a lot of people who do this, we talk to our students and they give us feedback and they would tell us things that, oh, I'm so much less stressed, I'm so much less anxious under this. Well, it's great for students to say those kinds of things, but we also want to have some empirical things to point to as we're trying to make this argument to other people about the benefits of this system. So as I was thinking about this more, anxiety and stress are these big kind of psychological things, right? So there's lots of different flavors of anxiety. For me as a math instructor, we think about math anxiety a lot. And when we're thinking about assessment, right, we're thinking about that test anxiety.
Right.
So I wanted to look and see, does this test anxiety actually change, right? If they're telling me they're less anxious, is that something else? Are they just
We measure
more
it.
anxious, less anxious, right? Or is this something I can actually measure? So I did one study where I gave them a standardized test anxiety instrument at the beginning of the semester, gave it at the end of the semester, expecting it to go down. It didn't. It went up.
Oh,
Yeah, that's what I said. Uh, but I had also had, I had an open-ended question on there where they were still telling me things like, oh yeah, I'm less stressed. I'm less anxious. So I thought about this for a minute. And by a minute, I mean several months. And eventually I kind of developed the hypothesis that, okay, kind of the way I was doing this, I was doing it at the beginning of the semester, at the end of the semester. No matter what I do at the end of the semester, my students are stressed because it's finals and
right.
everything, right?
Whether it's in your class or all of the above, right?
Exactly. So I decided to run the experiment again. But at the end of the semester, I asked them, tell me about your anxiety in this class, and then tell me about your anxiety in your other classes.
Smart.
And there we saw it go in different directions, right? So in their other classes, it was higher than the beginning of the semester. But in the standards-based grading course, it was lower than the beginning of the semester.
Cool. And was there space for them to kind of share their response? Were there any responses that stood out to you in collecting that data?
I mean, a lot of times when we ask these things, they tell us kind of a lot of similar things about just being less stressed and less anxious, and they had more space to focus on the learning. One of the comments I love as a math instructor that we get sometimes is they'll say things like, I feel like I actually learned in this class,
Oh,
which kind of makes me sad about all their other experiences, right?
but you bring up such a good point that math is so value laden, and people come into your classroom already with an assumption of I'm good at math or I'm bad at math. And so if you're able to shift those beliefs, that's powerful work.
Yeah, I mean, especially at the post-secondary level, right? So they've been
Yeah.
baked in for 12, 13, 14 years at this point.
It's so cool because I think what you're describing really is such a cultural shift in the way that we view assessment. And I think it permeates the K 12 space in the US that there's this almost like gotcha culture and assessment, as opposed to having it inform teaching and learning, and assessment being an us job towards moving the learning forward. And it's cool to hear stories of what this looks like in your experience.
Yeah, I mean, I always think it's really interesting because when I think about, okay, the quote unquote real world, right? Outside of the educational space, there are no grades, right? It's all about feedback and improvement and these kinds of things. So why are we so focused on those grades in the educational space with our kids and trying to help them learn?
I don't know, Drew. I think I'd only give you a 92% right now. You really step it up in this podcast. I'm kidding.
Mm-hmm. 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 Mm-hmm.
Funny. The other thing I thought was cool is standards-based grading Let's talk about what happened when we shifted the grading. What happened to gender?
Yeah, so it's kind of well established in the literature that women and girls tend to have higher test anxiety than men and boys. And so
And
when I was
math
looking at the
anxiety.
yes, and math anxiety, yes. And when I was looking at the data I collected in my courses, at the beginning of the semester we saw this expected difference, right? So
Mm.
the girls and the women in my case, right, had higher test anxiety than the men in my classes. And when I looked at the end of semester, in the standard-based grading classes, that difference had actually been eliminated. We still saw it when I asked them about their other classes, but in that standards-based grading class, they were right there. The women and the men had the same levels of test anxiety.
And why do you think that is?
I think it's complicated.
I know.
You know, um, yeah, I was thinking about this before we started talking, and I think there's lots of things going on with stereotype threat and kind
Mm.
of internalized messages that girls and women get about math through our society, and so it's hard to combat all of those things. One thing I found in some other research I did that was interesting. So at the post-secondary level, instructors tend to have office hours where students can come by and ask questions or whatever. And among standards-based grading practitioners, some of them will do what they call office hours reassessment. So one thing with standards-based grading is you give your students lots of opportunities to show you that they've learned. And so some instructors say, well, I'm sitting here but waiting for my students to come. If they can come to my office hours and show me they've learned something, that's great.
Great.
Yeah, so lots of instructors offer this. And when I was starting out and started doing this, I kind of noticed, in my math classes, it's primarily men in my math classes once we get to a certain level, right? Um, but in my office hours, there was a much more balance among the gender. So I actually tracked this, and we saw that women were actually coming to do these office hours reassessments more than the men in the math classes.
Mm. It makes me think of like psychological like the values affirmation identity affirmation research. Like it just makes me wonder if it's easy to blanket yourself as I'm bad at math, but when I get back a report that shows like, oh yeah, I'm still developing in this skill, but actually I'm really strong in these other ones. If it makes math not this just like unachievable black box, but I don't know, it's almost like, does that resonate with you at all?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I like about it is that it can help you highlight kind of the individual strengths of students.
Right.
I mentioned when they talk to each other that some would be like, well, I got this one. Did you get this one? This other one that I didn't get, and they help each other. And I think that helps them realize that there are different things, and different students will learn different things at different rates, right?
Right.
And it's not there's no like kind of holistic judgment on that. It's just they happen to learn different things quicker or better in some ways, and then they
Cool.
find that they can all help each other on those things.
Well, instead of it being a homogenous high group, low group, yeah,
Yeah,
it really
exactly.
kind of mixes the pot a little bit more.
Yeah, so without putting that number on the top, right? I think students are less apt to kind of label themselves, right, based on what those numbers are or what those categories are.
This is such cool work. I'm so excited to like be recording this podcast and to be talking with you about it because these are huge things we're talking about here, like gender bias, anxiety. But the next topic that comes up is growth mindset, and that's something
Mhm.
that you'd think would go hand in hand with anxiety would be a development of growth mindset, but your
Yep.
research kind of pivoted there. So might you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so a lot of people who do this say that one of the reasons is they want to promote a growth mindset in their students, which I also agree with, right? I think that's a great thing to promote in our students. And if you think about this idea of, oh, we're going to give you lots of opportunities to show that you've learned, right? There should be some kind of promotion
Totally.
of growth mindset here. But what I've seen in the literature, and in my research in particular, if you give the students one of these standardized growth mindset instruments, we haven't seen a shift over the course of a semester. And so my hypothesis for why this is, because you can actually see shifts in these instruments with some very short targeted interventions. They've done these kinds of things where at like a college orientation, they can give them a short intervention and actually see a change in the growth mindset there. But I think this growth mindset instrument that I used in particular, and I've seen a couple other researchers use this, is this real kind of, I don't want to say generic, but it's all about
Hmm.
intelligence and growth in general, right?
I can do hard
So
things. If I set a
yes,
goal, I can reach it.
right. And so I'm not sure the students are necessarily connecting what's happening in my calculus class with that
Mhm.
big idea of like, oh, I can learn anything. So I need to do more research to confirm this, but kind of my hypothesis is if we gave them a more targeted instrument, right, about just their math learning in particular, there we might see some of these growth oriented things actually changing.
Mm. I think it might be a combination of both to a more targeted instrument and then potentially even more explicit instruction of like what you just did of comparing a standard and then setting a learning goal for yourself and then achieving a standard. That is growth. That's growth mindset. Like,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There's more of that kind of metacognition helping them recognize that, hey, here's a hard thing that you didn't know how to do, and now you know how to do it.
right, because it always feels like the needle moves, right? We see that as I become good at something, well, that's an easy thing to be good at. But to help
Yeah,
them really recognize, no, this felt impossible to you before.
yeah,
But I'd be curious to see the new studies on that when they come out.
yeah.
So fun. What a cool your classroom sounds like it's such a like an experiment and a playground. Do you have a lot of fun in your job?
Yeah. So, I mean, I always enjoy going and, I feel like I've got my classes set up these days as where I just get to go and play math with my students for an hour. So I really love that.
That's so cool. Awesome. All right. So I'm curious because some students really tend to thrive in a standards-based grading environment, and some really kind of panic and freak out. It's a lot of change, it's a lot of difference. What do you find makes the difference between when students thrive and when it really is overwhelming for them?
Yeah, I don't want to say there's one thing because I think our students are have lots of different backgrounds, right? Um, so some of the things are just one, it's unfamiliar,
Right.
right? So you have to help them through that unfamiliarity. Another group of students that we see sometimes struggle a little bit are ones that got really good at this game of school,
The high
right?
achievers.
They know how to collect those points in that partial credit, right?
Right.
And now that you've taken that away, they're like, well, this is not the game I signed up for and got really good at, and so that can be challenging for them too. Another group, we have to focus a lot on making sure they understand kind of how the system works and what opportunities they have for reassessments.
Mm.
So a lot of different practitioners of standards-based grading will offer their students kind of optional opportunities to reassess, right? So I'm not going to make you take another test or something, but if you need to, here's another chance to show me that you've learned.
Cool.
And there's some groups of students that you need to work really hard to make sure they understand that they have those opportunities,
It's a culture
right?
shift.
Yeah. Um, so I think it's a lot of different things that we have to work on, and it's not something that we can just kind of explain it at the beginning of the term and say this is how it's going to be. We have to keep on working on it and reminding them and kind of checking in on them throughout the semester to make sure they understand what it is they need to do to show that they've learned in this course.
I think that makes so much sense. And I wonder what percentage of your class time do you feel like has shifted to explaining how grading and assessment and really the process of learning works?
Um, I don't know about a percentage, but these days I would do about 2 full days at the beginning of the term. So for me, a term would be 15 weeks where we meet three times a week. And so 2 of those days in the first week of class, we'd spend talking about not just the assessment, but kind of all the active learning things we're going to be doing in the class and what that looks like and how to learn, how to be successful in this class, what you need to be doing, all those sorts of things.
Smart. And I think so much of I love what you said about like the game of school and just explaining that this is a game and it has been for you and it's worked for you in the past and the rules are changing and that's going to be intimidating, but here's how the rules work now.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of two schools of thought with this. Is that if this whole grading thing is a game, then we should just kind of change the rules of how the game is played so that it kind of aligns with what we want to do. And then there's the other school of thought is that, well, learning should not be a game, right? We should kind of throw out take the game board and flip it over and just focus on the learning, and trying to figure out how to do that within all of our institutions and systems that are set up kind of from kindergarten through post secondary, right, is really built around grades, right? So it's kind of
Right.
hard to contend with that.
But this does feel like a shift in the right direction of saying, okay, let's figure out what really matters, what we want students to show competency of, and give them as many opportunities as possible to demonstrate that competence and not punish them for early failures. Feels like a pretty like shouldn't be that revolutionary a shift, but like if we could get everybody tomorrow doing it, feels like it would make a really big difference.
Yeah, and I mean that's how I pitch it to my students, and I tell them, oh, by the way, at the end of the semester, the registrar makes me assign you a letter grade.
Right.
So because of that, here's how I'm going to do it. But until then, we're going to focus on the learning, and here's all these things that we want to learn in here, and how we're going to help each other learn all those things.
Love that. And I mean, for leaders listening to this, is that a reasonable ask of your teachers if they use standards-based grading throughout the semester? I mean, at the end of it, we know report cards, we know GPAs, that's part of the big beast of a system. Like, is that how you'd explain it to them as well? Just at the end, this is how you figure it out and just only assign a letter grade at the end?
Yeah, I mean it's a little bit tricky, right? Because students have these expectations, and then at the K-12 level, parents have these expectations you have to deal with too, right? So there's this whole communication piece where, and now, I'm seeing
Mhm.
this. I have a daughter that started middle school this year, so we've got the grade portal to log into, right, to see all these numbers and things, and so there's this whole other level of, right, well, how do we communicate what we're doing, right, to the students and to the parents and get everybody kind of on board when this is very different than what they're used to. It's very easy to log in and see, oh, you got a 93 in science. Okay, you're doing okay.
Right.
Rather than looking at a whole list of things and saying, oh, well, these are the things we need to work on. It can feel overwhelming if you're not kind of expecting that or used to that or understand what's going on.
We've talked a little bit about building student buy-in. Um, and I know this is not necessarily your area because you don't deal with families as much, but do you have
Hmm.
any advice about building buy-in with families?
Yeah, I mean, the way I always think about it is that when we start out, I mean, I think almost everybody at like kindergarten, right? Their report card is very standards based,
Right.
right? And then
Totally.
at some point it changes. So for my daughter, until this year, it was all standards based reporting. Until this year is the first one where they actually had some weighted average rating, which I thought was wonderful, right? But at some point there's a shift.
Right.
But that's something you can build on, right? And say that, well, before this change, right, you had this standards based reporting in elementary school and everybody was okay with it. So why is it so much harder to do now? What's the big difference here that we can't keep on doing this thing that we were used to before? And I think
Yeah.
a lot of it's just that expectation that, well, when I was in school, I got these numbers. So I expect that that's the way it's going to happen.
I do think it all comes back to education and that really it's such an equitable and beautiful practice that if you can help folks explain it, I think it's fine. And what do you think of introducing the idea of just like the inequity of the curve? Like if I start and I don't understand and I get a 20%, there's no way I'm going to be able to even score an A at the end of the course. Like, is that an approach that you've taken with students to build buy-in?
Um, I think most students kind of get that, so that's not usually a hard sell for them.
Yeah.
I guess kind of one of the challenges we have, particularly with the students, is they ask us things like, "Well, I don't understand where I stand," which
Everyone wants to be sorted and ranked. I've got even in elementary classrooms, where is my child? What number are they?
right, and with the standards base, we're much more focused on, well, here's the things you've shown that you've learned so far, and here are the things you need to work on. And we're not going to worry so much about like where's the stand. Like I'm just focused on at the end of the semester where you're at. So one thing I do with my students is I show them a graph. So I've done this for quite a few years now, so I have lots of data on my students. And so one semester I was teaching a large calculus class, and I just took their progress over time, just the number of standards they showed me, right, over time across the
Cool.
semester, and plot. Everybody got a nice little curve, right? And I show them this graph where I pick out two students, where one of them, I guess I'm waving my hands on a podcast, so that's not helpful, but one of them was kind of low at the beginning and very slow, and then at the end has kind of a sharp increase versus one that kind of steadily goes up in a much more linear fashion.
Mm,
And I point to them and I, say, look, at the end, they end up at the same place.
right.
And that's what we care about, right? We don't care, how how fast you go up initially, right? Or when this learning actually takes place. I just need to know at the end of the semester, I have to send a letter to the registrar. So that's what we're focused on. Everybody's going to have a different shaped curve, right? Everybody's going to have a different path. That's
Cool.
okay, right?
That's so funny. So I was just in a keynote. Joe Feldman, he does a lot with equitable grading, and he
Yep.
showed that, and like just in a room full of educators, showed three different students' paths, and it was like one student started low and then went high. One student started high and stayed the same. And he's like, what would you assign each of these kids as a grade? And he used like a Mentimeter so we could see, and everybody
Hmm.
scored them differently. And it was like, and that's the problem, I think, with the traditional grading system is that we all have different ideas. And when you shift towards competency or standards-based grading, it eliminates so much of that ambiguity. And it's just about at the end of this given amount of time, what can you demonstrate? Which is just,
Exactly.
is so much more simple.
Yes.
So cool. Can you talk a little bit more about the role of feedback in standards-based grading and how you manage that as a teacher?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think as an instructor, what really frustrated me before I switched to standards-based grading was I would spend all kinds of time leaving feedback for my students on their work. And
Mm,
as I mentioned, they wouldn't even look at it. They'd look at the number and they'd shove it in their backpack and it would never be seen again.
right.
So I think that's a frustration that, many instructors share that the way to learn is to try something and to get feedback on it and then to act on that feedback,
Right.
right? So if we're skipping that last part of like acting on that feedback, right, then how can we expect the learning to take place? So I really like in standards-based grading, right, when I don't have those numbers on there, I put those feedback and students will actually look at it and pay attention to it and act on it. And so that really helps that learning cycle, right? So
Mm,
maybe it still takes them a few cycles, right? But I tend to see a lot more growth kind of from one attempt to the next, where they're not just making the same mistake over and over again.
smart. As a teacher, is that a challenge for you to come up with the multiple versions of assessments or like opportunities to show competency? Or like, are you using AI to help you with that? Or what have you kind of found are some ways to keep yourself organized?
Yeah, so this varies a lot by discipline. So I teach math, so it's relatively straightforward for a lot of things to kind of algorithmically generate a whole bunch of problems that are kind of attacking the same kind of learning standard. So I rely a lot on software to help me generate a whole bunch of assessments. I know I have colleagues that teach like biology, for example, and they have a much harder time trying to come up with unique assessments of the same standard there. So I think we're still in the very kind of early stages of this. I think some people are playing around with using generative AI for those kinds of things. I'm really hesitant about that myself, just because you have no control over whether what it tells you is correct or not, right? Or whether it's actually going to be assessing what you want with the students. So there's this layer of you're going to have to check every single thing it tells you.
Yeah, you
Um,
need the human in the loop for sure.
yeah, but maybe that can still be a time saver in terms of actually generating text. It's going to be faster to read something that it generates and say yes or no, right? Than maybe to generate that yourself. So I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
And even that, I think, is such a mindset shift for teachers. Is this concept at Universal Design for Learning has the concept of
Hmm.
firm goals but flexible means.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the terms that like resonates with me when it comes to standards-based grading is that yeah, we've got clear ideas of what success looks like, but how we get there and how you show it, there's a lot more wiggle room and flexibility. There's not just one right way.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing I push a lot when I work with faculty. It's okay. So not only do you want to give your students many opportunities to show their learning, you want to think about giving them multiple methods to show their learning, right? So not just quizzes and tests. I mentioned that I would have students come to my office hours and show me they could do something on a chalkboard, right?
Right.
Or some instructors have students record video explanations, right? There's so many other ways you can do this. There's logistical things to worry about, right? But the
Of
more
course.
ways you can offer your students, right, the better.
I love that because I think so many times, especially in the K through 12 space, we default to a 5 paragraph essay. And like we're not even assessing writing. We're assessing their understanding of an ecosystem through a 5 paragraph essay. And it's like that's just simply not going to be accessible for the majority of our students. And what better ways there are to demonstrate understanding of ecosystems than a random 5 paragraph essay?
Yeah, and I think it's extra challenging in the K-12 space just because of the kind of the differences in prep time, right? So
Mhm.
y'all spend a lot more hours actually in face-to-face time with the students,
True.
right? Um, but I do think there's still a space there for, collaborating with all the science teachers at the middle school, right? Can get together and think about what these science assessments could look like. I think that kind of collaboration, right, is really kind of the key to managing. It's a lot of work to give your students a whole lot more opportunities to do this, right? But if you can collaborate and kind of share that workload a bit, I think that can be a way forward.
Well, and it's collaboration centered on really clear learning targets. And I think that's the piece, especially in K-12 and in US schools specifically, that I'm seeing a lot of room for growth in, is having very clear expectations of what success looks like and being able to talk about that as teaching teams is, yeah, for me. Is that similar in the college level of articulating those like clear expectations? Is that ever a challenge or is that pretty well documented?
No, I think it's a bigger challenge for us in post-secondary. I mean, at least at K-12, right? You have states that are putting out standards, right? We have Common Core standards, which are a pretty darn good starting point if you're going to
Right.
do something like standards-based grading. But at the post-secondary level, we don't have those for hardly any of our courses. Some of the common ones, I think there are some pretty reasonable expectations of what happens in say, a Calculus 1 course, right? So a lot of that's driven by AP these days, but there's a fairly shared understanding, and most people don't take too long to kind of write down a list there. But there's usually not like a list that we can consult of like, here are kind of the things where we should be starting with.
Mm. So the creation of competencies. Do you have experience in that and like helping people create competencies? Any guidance there? Or would you say defer to what you can find?
No, I mean, almost all post-secondary instructors that are doing this, they have to come up with these on their own. So there's, one thing we're trying to do is put together kind of repositories of syllabi that instructors who have done this before have used,
Mhm.
and we can share those to give people kind of a starting point.
Inspiration.
But I mean, some of it's just they need to sit down and do the hard work of thinking about what do they want their students to learn in this class. And it's kind of shocking to me that before I did standards based grading, I never really thought about that question, which is wild to me, right? Like
Right.
I'm teaching these students, and I never even thought about what do I want them to learn by the end of the semester.
Yeah, it's like the metaphor I use often is like building a house without a blueprint. And like, especially in K through 12, you can have a bunch of really good architects coming together to like build a house. But if they have no blueprint, if they have no time to talk about the design and no
It's,
timelines, like you're going to get a really weird house.
yeah, and that's going to work really well for some students, but I think it's going to leave a lot of students behind.
Beautiful. We talked about this kind of lightly, but I wonder, we kind of bump up against the big beast of like the GPA and college admissions in K through 12. And I wonder, standing on the other side of that, like, are you seeing that shift or break at all? Or do you think we still have a long way to go there?
I think there's still a lot of work to do. I mean, at universities, the admissions is almost completely separate from the role of faculty, right? So it's
Right.
like completely separate office. They make their own kind of decisions. As a math instructor, I think a lot about like the role of calculus in college admissions, right? So as far as I'm concerned, they don't need calculus to come to college. We teach millions of students calculus at colleges every year,
Right.
right? But most university admissions offices, if they see that calculus on the transcript, right, then they will give that
Ooh.
student a bump up, right?
Right.
So I think kind of all of these things are a little bit kind of interconnected, but I think we got a lot of work to do in kind of um, shifting the mindset around the college admissions.
And it's happening-ish. Like Mastery Transcript Consortium, I think, has made a
Right.
lot of progress. I think what we saw happen during COVID with, testing and shifting towards portfolios in some universities, like we're seeing the inklings of it starting to happen, but it's definitely not institutionalized yet.
Yeah, and we're also seeing a backlash now, right, where some of the institutions are deciding to go back to the standardized tests and things like that, and getting rid of the test optional admissions, which I think is disappointing.
So your best advice, I would assume then for middle school and high school teachers who kind of need to keep this GPA thing going is like we said earlier, throughout the 98% of your class, you're not talking about numbers, you're not ranking and sorting students. It's all about proficiency and competencies. And at the end of the semester, or however often you need to do it, you consolidate that into something that translates into a GPA.
Yeah, I think that's probably the healthiest way to approach it, and just be transparent with the students as, at the end of the term, right? That's how we're gonna do it. And
Smart. Well, and
until
this is where
until
you
then, we're just gonna
stand
focus on
now.
numbers. Yeah,
And you still have all of next semester. Like, that's
yeah,
so
exactly.
hard.
Yeah,
It's so funny because I was an elementary teacher and did so much of this assessment. And I always, reporting season just felt so icky to me, having to finally put that like final letter grade onto it. So it's, I don't know,
yeah. It's one of my least favorite parts of the job, right?
same for sure. Fun. Well, I think this has been such a cool conversation and so clear about standards based grading. I'm curious if you were talking to a school leader or an educator who feels really excited by this, but maybe a little bit stuck or a little bit overwhelmed, where might you suggest beginning?
Yeah, I think the most helpful things for folks starting to do this are to find community with others that are doing this. So there's some different groups. I mean, you mentioned the Mastery Transcript Consortium. At the post-secondary level, there's a large annual conference I help organize called the Grading Conference. It's mostly focused on the post-secondary. But actually, I just saw an advertisement this morning for a standards-based grading conference for school leaders in Iowa coming up this summer. So I think there are pockets of people who are doing this and trying to connect into those communities. A lot of it's individual instructors connecting through some of these communities on social media. But I think if the more we can get kind of the school leaders connected to these communities and supporting those changes that their teachers want to make, then I think the better we'll be.
Find your people. And there's so many great books out there right now, especially in the K through 12 space. People like Tom Guskey and Joe Feldman who
Yeah.
are singing the praises about what this can look like practically. So, yeah, I think there's support out there and it's a growing movement, but there is an element of kind of like staying strong in the storm somehow.
Yeah.
So fun. Well, thank you so much for such a cool conversation and just for the work that you're doing and the insights from your data. I just thought it was such interesting research and it was such a delight to talk to you.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been fun.